Thank you, Seumas. Thank you, Carla. That was excellent. Thank you for the detailed and insightful answers to these questions all over the place. So well done. Okay, so for our next talk, we bring in a panel of three excellent representatives of this online teaching. One of them we've already met is Seumas himself. But for those of you who don't know much about him, he is an online teacher, founder of Seumas U, teaching Greek and Latin via communicative methods, and he's developed it into his full-time job and business of the last 7 years. Before that, though, he did a PhD in ancient history at Macquarie University with a dissertation on late antique dogmatic exegesis. That's a mouthful. He does lots of translation, research, learner-centered projects. You might have encountered his Lingua Graeca per se, Illustrata, and stuff like that, with interest in texts from all different periods. And he's going to be accompanied by Mike Saridakis. Mike is a high school Latin teacher, a friend of mine as well, and he's been developing a system of D&D style RPGs. In fact, the first time we met was actually at the Our Voices conference, and he ran a little RPG for us and a couple of the other organizers at the bar after the conference, which was delightful. But he does that for his students, but also for more advanced speakers. He's created some short adventures with D&D. He also does a lot of working with texts and making them available, comprehensible for students and for teachers to use, like his Gesta Francorum, which I know Seumas is using now. I will probably use at some point as well, and Aeneid 1, and something for AP Caesar. And they are accompanied by Isaac Bennett-Smith, who's an instructor at Seumas U and a PhD student at Teharenga, is that how it's said? Teharenga Waka Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. He teaches Greek and Latin there and collaborates on the translation of ancient plays for the Victoria Ancient Theatre Society. And he has experience with organizing and playing RPGs in Latin and Greek at a range of levels. So not surprisingly, they are going to be talking to you about language learning through RPGs at every stage. So I will hand it over to the panel now.
Thanks. I am going to stick all three of us, so you can see all three of us here. I'm going to speak first and briefly, I'm going to talk about RPGs or role-playing games for language learning, and particularly how each of us has kind of done that in particularly different stages, different kind of learner levels. But perhaps you don't know what RPGs are, or perhaps you've never seen one played. If you've never seen one played, you should go and just watch a YouTube video, not right now during our talk, but afterwards. But essentially, it's a form of collaborative storytelling in which one participant, or in which, all the other participants except bar one are players, and they have a character who is a persistent role or identity through the story over time that they are responsible for. The other participant is sometimes called a game master or a storyteller or something like that, and they are responsible for narrating everything else that happens in the world. So the world and all other characters. So for example, if my friend Isaac here is some kind of heist master and says he's going to climb out the outside of a building, then as a storyteller, I describe what happens. What does the building look like? What happens when he climbs? Does he succeed? Does he fall? All those kinds of things. I think the most commonly known RPG in public awareness is Dungeons and Dragons, but actually there's a huge variety of games in different genres, different settings with different complexities of rules or not, and different themes. For myself, I've been gaming like this for a long time, and I've now run 5 or 6 instances of games which kind of have, in theory, they're classes, but they're more like, I could think of them as learning experiences. So 5 times in Latin and 1 time in Greek. And the settings have varied. I've told stories set in ancient Carthage, in pre-Roman Gaul, in late antique Constantinople, 2 games set in near-future science fiction settings. In all my classes, I've had fairly advanced learners. Sometimes not so advanced speakers or people who are not really comfortable speaking or have never spoken before, but generally people who have a relatively good grasp of the language. Sometimes this is their first speaking experience, but usually not. And so it's definitely kind of at the upper end of the spectrum of types of learners and expectations. And that's shaped the way I do it. So in my own experience in English in RPGs is very kind of improvisational, free-flowing, open-ended choices. What do you want to do? Little emphasis on rules or those kinds of things. This works for me in terms of what I'm trying to achieve. That is, how do we give an occasion to use Latin or Greek in an open-ended kind of conversational setting that isn't exactly the classroom? Like, it's kind of the classroom, but it wouldn't have to be the classroom. Like, you could do this just for fun all the time if you wanted to. But it's an imaginary setting where you can take on other roles and personas that you couldn't or wouldn't or probably shouldn't in real life. That is, things that are fantastical, a crime that you probably shouldn't do in real life, or just things you won't get a chance to do normally in Latin or Greek. In particular, I think this has 3 pedagogical pros that are worth considering. One, in terms of spoken work, in terms of communicative work, it gives you a chance to use a lot more first and second person forms than would typically come out of texts. So this is just kind of a grammar and morphology kind of bonus. Like, even reading, anything you read just will not normally have the volume of first and second person forms that you will get in this kind of dialogue and conversation and storytelling. Secondly, one of the things I love about it is that it gives you the opportunity to decenter ancient Romans and Greeks. So much of our material, especially basic teaching material, is focused on upper class, wealthy male Romans or Greeks, but they aren't the only things our languages can do. And if we want to explore other, particularly, representation and diversity, one way of doing that is telling new stories in new spaces with new characters. That have nothing to do with, this is what I love, they have nothing to do with ancient Rome. So the Greek story I told was set in a dystopian kind of near future version of Bombay, and it was a horror story, and it just had nothing to do with ancient Greece. Thirdly, I think it's useful in that it's generally, I think you want to avoid stress in language learning, but I think there are times when stress is good. And the thing about being in a game is that it's a real-time conversation that is flowing, that is high stress, but it's because you're having fun and you're invested in what's happening. So it's not high stress because it's a test. It's high stress because you care about what's going to happen. And I think there's a real value in that. I'm going to hand over to, I think, to Mike. Mike.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so I do a lot of stuff with intermediate and beginner level kids. So I've got a little presentation. Hopefully I'm going to be able to get through this in a normal time. Like I said, I work with a lot of novice and intermediate targeted students. So things are a little bit different for me in that obviously the kids aren't able to speak and respond and engage in conversation at the same kind of level. So what I do is significantly more structured. The basic unit is I start with kind of a demo day. It's a super rules light scenario. They just have to like solve some sort of puzzle together. I let them speak in English. It's 1 day to 2.5 class, 1 or 2.5 classes. Nobody has class, nobody has powers. It's just kind of like, all right, you're in this scenario. What do you do? And it just kind of gets them thinking about that. Because again, I have to work with a lot of kids who probably have never done this before, as opposed to something like Seumas does, where he's able to like just put it out there as something and attract people who are into that kind of stuff. So I actually don't even begin by playing the game. Where I found the most value is actually in special persona interviews. And essentially what I do is a special person interview, or it's sometimes called Star of the Day, a fairly common method of teaching in a CI-based language class. And we use that to build their characters. And at the end, they end up with a little paragraph, and we all read the paragraph together. And so this is another great part of this, is that I'm building a library of texts that the students are familiar with. And by doing that, I can actually make the text fairly I don't want to say complicated, but more complex than something that that's totally decontextualized for them. So it's a richer reading experience if that happens. So after we do these interviews for a couple of days, we move on to playing the game for a couple classes. Ironically, I spend less time playing the game than I do making the characters. I found that's because that's what they're more interested in doing. And then at the end, so after every game, we do another similar write and discuss activity. So the class works together to recount what we had just done in the game. And then we put that in a Google Doc. And at the end of the class, we do just like a basic read through of it, maybe a few comprehension questions or an exit ticket or something. And then off we go. Then I set it aside for a while because, again, I'm working with much larger groups of kids than Seumas necessarily is. So making characters, the interviews, like I said, it's literally just special person. I do a survey. So again, I'm working with a much larger group of kids. So not everybody gets to play right away. I do a survey and I ask them who has experience playing tabletop role-playing games, who wants to play, who is completely opposed to this. And basically I take the people that are most interested and most experienced and I start with them so that the rest of the class can observe what a game of a tabletop role-playing looks like. So when it's their turn, they're not totally in the dark. I actually start this fairly early in the year with the special persona interviews. I kind of have it keyed into chapter 2 of Lingua Latina per se Illustrata. So we go through that chapter, we do an assessment. Yeah, you're all good. Okay, let's talk about our characters. Yes, like I said, after the interview, we just do a write and discuss, and I've got an example of that later. Shopping is another thing. We don't have time to talk about it. I've got all of this more well written out elsewhere. I can share it if anybody's interested. Let's see. Okay. So here's an example of one of the slides from the special persona interviews. It's Latin with the English underneath it, because what I want is to get the students working with prompts. I want them to learn how to follow a flow chart to do what they want, because that's going to be key when we get to the unit itself. So, unde venet persona tua? Where's your character come from? They come from a small nomadic tribe. Great, wonderful. And then I turn to the class and I'm like, omnes persona discipuli venet ab tribo nomadico parvo. And then everyone's like, oh, or most of the time they're like, oh. So, like I said, really great flow chart. This is going to be key to later in the unit, so we're getting some practice now. The key here is that we are not having the person practice production, but rather we're having them create input for their classmates. Yeah, that's the other takeaway here. So here's an example that we did for one of my very creative students. She wanted to be a Tabaxi warlock, or a half Tabaxi warlock, excuse me. So after the interview, we come back together and the whole class tells me about the character and I write it down dutifully on the computer. I'll gloss some of the words that maybe they wouldn't know necessarily, but are important for the story. And then we'll end the class with just a short little exit ticket. And then at the end, when we have the whole party all together, we'll do some sort of more creative assignment. I think for this class, because they were like that, I actually did a who would win in a fight, and everybody had to argue why their character would beat their opponent in a fight. And then the winner got a little prize. Running the game. Okay, so now we have all of our characters. I have 40-minute classes. So we start with a short review of yesterday's events. I'll throw yesterday's write-up on the board, which I'll show you guys in a second. We just read through it, clarify anything. I might do a little bit of circling if I'm noticing that some of the phrases are not sticking in their brains very well. Then we start playing. We play for about 20 minutes. Can I talk about this later? No, okay. I do all the rolling of the dice myself because I'm asking the players what kind of stats they have, and that's creating a conversation, a communicative situation that they have to navigate in Latin. After the game, we do a short write and discuss, like I've said 1,000 times now, and then just a little debrief in English at the very end. Just like, hey, did you guys have fun? Yeah. It's just nice to let off some steam, make sure everybody feels like they're getting heard. One of the things that I'm trying to do more with is reacts, emotes, and emojis. And I think this is something that like really makes online learning with this a very valuable tool, is that we can just drop in the chat reactions while the game is going for all the people watching. So those of you who are familiar with Twitch or Discord, there's a whole litany of fun little reactions that people can do. And then like you can check those and see like if it's appropriate to what's going on. You're like, okay, cool, everybody understands what's happening. The character sheet, this is key. It contains the stats of the players. It also contains the scaffolded flowcharts that they use to communicate with me. And I'm going to take you. So here's an example of what the character sheet looks like. I'm at the point now where I'm calling this second edition of whatever the heck we're doing because I introduced a magic system. So up here, we've got like basic biological data, HP, armor class. We've got your stats. I'm thinking about changing what that one is, but so here's what I really want to talk about. So when they get to a situation, I'll ask like, quid vis agere? What do you want to do? And they can say, Wolo, oh, let's say there's a door. They can say, Wolo ire in Yanuam. I want to go into the door. And then the whole class knows that's what they want to do because they're paying attention. Or if they're not, then I'll just restate what they said. And we're getting all kinds of repetitions with that. And I'll be also illustrating this on the board. Over here with the magic, we have the same idea. I want to throw light. I want to make a magic hand. So same idea. Practical suggestions for the classroom. This is the last two things I got to talk about. I hope I'm not going over. Give binary choices or multiple choices. Don't just say, what do you want to do? But rather ask, do you want to talk with the monster or do you want to fight the monster? It's not necessarily as open-ended, but they also don't have the language to be open-ended. And it also helps for students who might be not sure what they can do. So you can give them all kinds of crazy options and they'll take those crazy options. Some problems I have fully yet to resolve. I think this is going to be great for discussion later, so we can maybe come back to it. Yeah. Great. There's a bunch of stuff in the chat. I am stopping the sharing and coming back over. We can come back to this later, I think. So Isaac.
Great. Hello. I'll keep this bit brief so we can jump right into the discussion. So I've got a strangely split experience with RPGs in ancient languages. I've done quite a lot online with Seumas, mostly as a player. And in terms of running them, I've actually done it mostly in person. So one thing I've been really interested in is you get these sort of things where you're, like, oh, let's play an RPG in Latin. And everyone's like, yeah, that would be fun. But for a lot of people, you need a little bit of scaffolding to turn the sort of things you want to say or want to do or want to achieve into something that you can actually verbalize. And if you don't address that, I think that can be a serious problem because on the one hand, you have agency for players, which is great, and it creates the sense of being invested in the game. But then on the other hand, it can also create paralysis, and that makes it stop being fun, and it cuts off the stream of input, and it can get really awkward. So some of the things that I've done in person that have been really good are, for example, having a shared map. So one of the systems that I've used is called Dinosaur Princesses, and it's very good. I love that system. But it centers around a map, and all of the players collaboratively sort of design the world and draw on the map together. So there's a sort of shared ownership of the space, and you can point at things on the map and be like, oh, I'm going to go here, that sort of thing. It's a little bit more difficult to do online, but I think you could recreate some of that sort of thing with like a shared whiteboard or even just a shared Word document. I think having some sort of visual aid, especially where all of the participants can engage with it in a little bit of a sense, can help keep people grounded when otherwise all of this conversation is just happening sort of vocally, and something's said and then it's gone and maybe you misheard. It's easy to get lost. The other thing I want to talk about is I think the default assumption with RPGs is often that you have, one person who's running the game and then a bunch of players. And in a lot of scenarios, that's the way it has to be. If we think back to Carl's diagram of who knows Latin in the Latin classroom, right? Well, mostly one person knows Latin in the Latin classroom. So in that case, it's helpful for them to take on as much responsibility as possible. But another context where you might do this kind of thing, playing an RPG in Latin or ancient Greek, is with a bunch of your friends who might also be teachers. And in that case, one of the actual barriers is you're all busy and no one actually wants to put in all the work of being the sole person to run the thing. So in that kind of scenario, I'd encourage you to think about systems where you all work together to collaboratively tell the story and you share the responsibility of determining what the outcomes of things are and that sort of thing. So that's the sort of direction that I'm kind of curious about taking some of these things. If you maybe want to jump into the more discussion format now.
Yeah, so we're going to have a bit of a discussion among ourselves, but also happy to take questions now, particularly since we're early into our question time. Yeah, so Miletus is asking examples of these more collaborative games. I haven't really done many of them, Isaac.
All right, so there are lots that I don't know about, so I'll tell you about the ones that I do. So these are both made by a guy at my university called Hamish Cameron, who his publishing thing is called, I'll put it in the chat. So Dinosaur Princesses is not fully collaborative, but it's a lot more collaborative than a lot of other games. The basic principle is each player takes responsibility for a certain scene in the game, and you plot out the story of the game before you start. So like during the initial stages, you all agree what the key plot points are going to be, and each player takes responsibility for introducing a scene, and in each scene, they ask their fellow dinosaur princesses for help in overcoming whatever the obstacle is going to be. Another game also by Hamish Cameron is just come out called The David Webb, but it follows a model where there are a set of tables, you roll some dice, and you progress through a story, and at each instance you have to work together to determine what the outcome is going to be, to describe what's going on. So the basic principle is usually that you take turns sort of devolving that responsibility across the whole group of people. And you don't necessarily have to do as much upfront preparation because the system provides some of the content for you along the way.
Age.
Hello. Sorry, one more time. So in this world of like RPGs and stuff, as someone who also really enjoys gaming, there's games like Total War Rome, where you can recreate battles and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's created a very accessible form of history to a very certain subsect of our population. And I'm just curious if there's any, in addition to the benefits to RPGs and the format of RPGs in terms of learning language, if you found that there's any detractors as well, and if there have been any detractors in this attempt to create a more collaborative engagement for language, if within those detractors, if there's something that you think could be done alternately to encourage more participation.
Mike?
Oh, you mentioned Rome Total War, and I actually, at the end of my Latin 2, we studied the Punic War, and then at the end they have to build a strategy in Rome Total War. So like I have explored that in depth. So that's all I had to see. You said like the words that make me excited. So that I don't really have anything for the second part of your question, just the first part that made my lizard brain get excited. No. Seumas or Isaac, do you have anything for?
No, no, don't.
I think. You go.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. I think energy management and sort of commitment is something to keep in mind. I think the perennial problem with organizing RPGs in any language is like scheduling and getting everyone to the right place at the right time. So I think it's worth being aware that it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. If you have limited time and limited energy, then while running an RPG can be a really good thing, it might not necessarily be the most efficient use of time and energy for every situation. So I think it's an option, but it's not like a silver bullet, would be what I'd think.
I think too, so the different, Mike and I have very different approaches, and they kind of reflect like what Carla was talking about. So Mike does a lot of work up front. He's built all these material resources, scaffolding, which helps his students immensely because they have the materials there in front of them to produce things that will be input for others. I don't do that. Because I'm much more like the way I approach it is I'm just a performer on the day. So I just turn up and I just do my thing. And like that's incredibly energy intensive in the moment, but it doesn't produce any lasting resources for other people usually. Yeah, it's partly that's the, you know, it's you got to pick where you're going to put your energy and what's going to result. But also, I mean, partly that's about the demographics of the participants. There's no way that I could do that with beginner students because they would have paralysis and they would just not know what to do or say. It would just fall apart.
One good thing about that, from the student point of view, is that as a student you don't have to prepare, right? Like I don't have to read 60 lines of Virgil to go to Seumas's RPG class. I just show up. So that can be really good in an otherwise hectic schedule.
I kind of disagree with Seumas because I think this is just how he does. It's a choice he makes. But the key for me when I'm doing this, I have all the nice little fun stuff that we do. But the key is creating that text at the end of the class. That text then is a permanent resource. So I think there is a place, even if, and by the way, when I do these, I'm mostly improvising. Most of the stories I do at this point, it's like formulaic for me because I've run it for a couple of years now, and I've also published it online that you can download it. But it's so formulaic for me that I'm improvising and I'm creating these stories at the end that then I can use and reuse with different classes, because now I'm at a point where I can be like, hey, this is what you guys did. Let's compare it to this other class. Now finish the assignment. And then I get to scroll through Twitter and pretend I'm a good teacher. So yeah, I think at least for me, Seumas is about the communicative task and I'm about the creating the text that I can use multiple times.
I think too. So I don't, in the past, I've asked students to do a write-up each week, like a post-class write-up.
Oh yeah.
I think if I was in an actual classroom, I would do more writing about what we did to produce a text that told the story in retrospect of what the players had done. Just reading the comments. In terms of, yeah, so Joe's asking what are the differences between the Latin versions and the Greek versions for me. So I've only run Greek once, partly because I was much more comfortable doing it in Latin. I knew I could speak Latin better. And I knew I had a broader range of vocabulary in Latin and that I was going to run into gaps in my Greek much faster. So it took me a while before I was happy to run it in Greek. And I had a fairly select group of participants who I knew all could speak Greek quite well. So that made it a lot easier, but I still ran into major gaps in vocabulary where in Latin I would be particularly, so in both contexts, particularly if you're not doing something kind of ancient, suddenly you're into like, okay, how do I talk about video security cameras? How do I talk about hacking the internet? Those kinds of things. In Latin, I can neologize pretty well on the fly. In Greek, it's much more difficult. So that was another kind of thing that made it more difficult. Yeah, that's something.
I think that's for RPGs, one of the real draws for me is that you can set your game in whatever world you want. And so it's super easy to set it in a world where you have the domain to discuss the topics, right. Which is why I like to use Dungeons and Dragons specifically, because high fantasy medieval roleplay is very similar to the texts I'm interested in and the texts that I'm preparing my students to read. We do the AP curriculum, so knowing how to say kill, die, murder, sword, stab, spear, slaughter, those are important words. And
Right.
so I get to use them. Decapitate, dismember, lightning, fire. Yeah.
I'm going to wrap this up in a minute, but let me just say 2 more points about that. So in the second half of the Greek course, the Greek class, we kind of finished that story, and I said, okay, let's go and do something more kind of Dungeons and Dragons-y. And then it was time to bring out all the Homeric vocabulary, because it's all about this kind of thing. But also it's a really good way to find the gaps in your ability. Suddenly you realize, oh, I don't know how to talk about this. I don't have a word for this, and that kind of thing, which can be frustrating in the moment, but it creates a learning experience where you can go, okay, we need to figure this out, either in the moment or later on.